Good evening. My name is John Herron. I am the Director and Chief Executive of the Kansas City Public Library System. And on behalf of that system, I want to welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. Those of you here in person in the lovely Kirk Hall, and the many, many more of you watching via live stream. We have a special and what we feel will be a very important program this evening. Our country, sadly, is divided on any number of issues, too many issues. Each side, all sides, entrenched, each trying to talk over and talk down the other. Too seldom do we work to communicate, to say not just here's my side, but also let me hear yours. I'm not naive. I recognize that it's hard to find common ground, but perhaps we can come away with a little more perspective, some degree of mutual understanding, even a much-needed sliver of empathy. That's what we hope to do tonight. In examining the state of our major print and broadcast media, almost everyone agrees that they face challenges. They have flaws. The disagreement is about degree. At stake is a vital element in our democracy, the public's trust in an institution, the press, through which all of our history has helped shape public awareness and attitudes and guided citizens, remember voters, in making responsible, informed decisions. By all accounts, rightly or wrongly, that trust is now dimming. We are privileged to welcome former White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, who makes his position and that of his fellow conservatives clear in his most recent book, Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias: Why the Press Gets So Much Wrong and Just Doesn't Care. Ari Fleischer, as many of you know, served as President George W. Bush's press secretary from January 2001 to July 2003. He detailed his experiences in the Bush administration in his first book, the best-selling Taking Heat: The President, the Press, and My Years in the White House. He now heads Fleischer Communications, working with corporations and sports organizations, and is a prominent contributor to Fox News. Ari will talk about his book and then be joined on stage by David Von Draley, a columnist for one of Ari's primary targets, The Washington Post. David is in his second tenure with the Post, writing columns on national affairs and politics. He'd previously worked for the newspaper as a senior writer and assistant managing editor. In between, he spent a decade with Time magazine, authoring more than 60 cover stories as editor-at-large. He's also the author of 4 books, including the award-winning bestseller Triangle: The Fire That Changed America, about the devastating factory fire in 1911 New York City, as well as Rise to Greatness: Abraham Lincoln and America's Most Perilous Year. Together, David and Ari will discuss the book, the state of media affairs, and will then take as many of your questions as time allows. Over the course of our discussion, we'll ask anyone here with a question to jot it down on one of the note cards that you can get from library staff. Those of you watching over our YouTube channel can submit questions via the chat box. Finally, for those of you who bought one of Ari's books, he'll sign copies afterwards in the library cafe adjacent to where they're being sold. Well, as for tonight, we take great pride in saying that this, among many other things, is what the Kansas City Public Library does so well. We're going to spend the next hour in public discourse, in a civil, respectful exchange of perspectives and views. Our goal is to enrich. We're not here to change minds, we're here to broaden them. And that is central to our mission in this city. Thank all of you for being here with us, and thank you so very much to Ari and David. Now, to begin, please join me in welcoming Ari Fleischer to Kansas City.
Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to talk to you about football. 4 football fans in the NFL are standing on top of a mountain, arguing about which one loves their team the most. One is a Kansas City Chiefs fan. One is an Oakland Raiders fan, one is a Denver Broncos fan, and one is a Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan. Well, the Raiders fan, he looks at his three friends standing on top of the mountain and says, none of you love your team as much as I love the Raiders. And to prove it, I'm going to leap off this mountain. He walks up to the edge of the mountain, looks down, leaps off, and all you can hear is, this is for Oakland. Well, the Bronco fan, he won't be outdone. He looks at his two friends standing on top of the mountain and says, neither one of you love your team as much as I love the Broncos. And to prove it, I'm going to jump off this mountain. He walks up to the edge of the mountain, looks down, leaps off, and all you can hear is, this is for Denver. Well, that leaves the KC fan and the Tampa Bay fan alone on top of the mountain, at which point the Chiefs fan walks up to the Buccaneers fan, pushes him off the mountain, and says, this is for everybody. Well, there's something else that is for everybody, and it's libraries. I can't tell you how good it feels to be in such a beautiful place like this library. I have a daughter who literally, from the day she was about 3 or 4, would always have a book in her hand. She would walk into walls holding on a book. She loves the feel of paper. She loves the feel of a book. She loves what libraries do and what they represent. And it's such a warm feeling to be here among you all. So thank you, John. Thank you very much to you and everybody at the library for the introduction. I appreciate it, and it's good to be here. My friend Steve Weberg. Steve, thank you for all you've done. You've been asking me to come and join you here for a couple of years. I'm so glad after COVID and after everything else could finally make it work. And wonderful to see you again. David Vondrelli, my friend David Vondrelli from the Washington Post. David and I go back, we were talking about it tonight, more than 20 years. So David, thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. And I want to especially thank my dear friend Nikki and Bill Hancock. I see Bill is already protesting me. He's walked out in my remarks ahead of time, a preemptive strike. But Nikki, always great to see your smile. So thank you to all of you for being here as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that are dear to my heart. Not only the book, but my time at the White House. I loved everything I used to do standing at that podium at the White House. Right around lunchtime on the East Coast, every day, right around 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, it was my sacred duty to walk up to that podium in the White House briefing room and assume the position of a human piñata. And I loved it. I loved standing my ground at that podium on behalf of a person and on behalf of ideas that I believe in deeply. And the trick to being White House press secretary, and it does not matter what party you belong to or what president you work for, the trick is to believe. If you believe in what you're doing and if you think it's the right thing to do, it is easy to stand your ground and take the hard questions. And particularly in the era I was there, the questions were hard. The press was coming at me, as is their right, as is the responsibility for the press corps under our First Amendment to the Constitution to ask whatever they want, however they want. And it was my job to have thought through the answers ahead of time, knowing as I took that podium that if I said A, it would make a reporter ask question B. And I already had to be thinking of answer C, knowing that would take them to question D. Being press secretary was kind of like playing intellectual chess with some of the smartest, sharpest, toughest, most seasoned, cynical, negative people you will ever meet. The White House press corps. And I loved it. I loved being where the front page, back in the days when front pages existed, I loved being at the podium knowing what would be on the front page before the front page was even printed. And it was the most intellectually stimulating, most exciting, best, most pressure-filled, difficult, hardest jobs I could ever hold. And I look back on it with fondness and with tremendous sense of how lucky I was to be a firsthand witness to so much of history when I was in that White House. But times have changed. America has changed. Our politicians have changed. The tenor of the debate has changed significantly. When I was press secretary, the press was liberal. They'd been liberal for decades. But when I was press secretary just 20 years ago, the media would tell you, and they would mean it, that their job was to be objective. Their job was to be neutral. It didn't matter if they had a bias because they knew they could not show it. And editors back then were old school. If they caught a whiff of people being overt and giving their opinions in a news page, the editors would come down on those reporters. It was not allowed. It was frowned on. Now, it seeped through, particularly when it came to story selection, that which was the definition of news, that which was not even covered. There still was elements of bias. But it was a totally different era. The press was different. Politicians were different. People were much more willing to compromise, to talk to each other, to be reasonable. We've entered a much more polarized era in which the press has changed too. Now, I'm a Fox News contributor, as John said to you in his introduction. I have my own biases. I wear them on my sleeve. Everybody knows what they are. Many books have been written about Fox News, many critical books about Fox and its role in the United States of America and as part of polarization. But I chose to write a book about the mainstream media, knowing many people can go to other sources and see what they want to read about conservative media. My book is about ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, where I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, more Americans get their news from those sources, particularly young people, whose news is really a retell of what was published by the mainstream media that makes its way into the internet and onto social media. Conservative media still remains a relatively small slice of America, even if Fox News shows are the #1 shows in America. The fact of the matter is 20 million people watch NBC, CBS, and ABC evening news. The #1 show on Fox gets between 3 and 4 million viewers a night. The mainstream media, even as much as it's in decline since its days of the 50s, 60s, 70s, still is the most predominant, powerful force of communications in the United States today. And that takes me to my book and why I wrote it. Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias, Why the Press Gets So Much Wrong and Just Doesn't Care. And I'm going to start with one of my favorite places to start. It's actually the place I watch the news in the morning, CNN. I watch CNN in the morning and I watch Fox News in the afternoon because I like to hear all sides of issues. Don Lemon had a show with 2 guests on it, picking up on something that Secretary Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, said. He did an interview with a reporter. He did not like how the interview went. He criticized the reporter publicly and said about this reporter that this reporter couldn't even find Ukraine on a map, said Pompeo about a reporter, which led to this discussion on CNN. Let's take a look.
University.
Right.
Also, he doesn't really say that she couldn't identify Ukraine on a map. He insinuates it's just a petty attempt to put her down, right? Is that what this is?
Of course. Of course. He's just trying to demean her, and obviously it's false. And look, he also knows deep in his heart that Donald Trump couldn't find Ukraine on a map if you had the letter U and a picture of an actual physical crane next to it. He knows that this is, an administration defined by ignorance of the world. And so that's partly him playing to their base and playing to their audience, the credulous boomer Rube demo that backs Donald Trump, that wants to think that Donald Trump's a smart one and y'all elitists are dumb.
You elitists with your geography and your maps and your spelling, even though my
your math and your reading.
Yeah, you're reading, your geography, knowing other countries, sipping your latte.
All those lines on the map.
Only them elitists know where Ukraine is. Sorry, I apologize. But by the way,
oh my God.
but you know what? It was Rick's fault. I blame Rick. But in all honesty, you know what NPR should do?
Why not? Sorry, hold on. Wait.
Can I tell
give
you
me a second. Hold on. So, no, it was good. Sorry. Rick, that was a good one. I needed that. Okay, so listen.
I begin my book with a written description of this broadcast. And I do so because as I watched you reacting to this, many people here think it was funny. Many other people in here were looking on it with disgust. Here's my point. It's one thing to make fun of President Trump. He's a politician. We do that in this country. We have a 200-year-old history of making fun of our politicians. They made fun, they derided half this country that is for Donald Trump. They said this is about the Boomer Rube demo that supports Donald Trump. How in the name of journalism can CNN allow a nighttime anchor whose job is to be objective? CNN does not say that their nighttime anchors are opinion show leaders. How can CNN's leaders, how could they have put this on the air, allowed Don Lemon, an anchor, to laugh his head off, to say, thanks, that was a good one, I needed that, when instantly, for half the country when they saw this, their reaction was, these journalists, all they know how to do is make fun of us. This is who they are. This is how they treat us. And if you want to know one of the reasons Donald Trump won in 2016, it's exactly because of this. It's because of people who've been treated like this for too much time over the last decade and recognize or said to themselves, at least someone like Donald Trump will fight for us because the deck is stacked against us. How CNN could allow this and think it's called journalism onto the air befuddles me. And it's a problem journalists have because when they leave the newsroom, is there anybody at CNN who said to Don Lemon, you went too far? You shouldn't have done that. You just made fun, not just of Donald Trump, but of Trump supporters. No. No one brought it to Don Lemon's attention. The White House briefing room. 49 seats in the White House briefing room. During COVID, the room was socially distant. There were hardly any reporters in the room. After about 1 year of COVID, reporters came back into the briefing room. All 49 seats were filled up. I got an idea as I was researching my book, and I saw that first briefing when reporters came back into the room. And I hired an opposition research firm. I hired a firm to go through the public records of the voter registration information for the 49 reporters who sit in that room. And let me tell you what I found. One Republican occupies a seat in that room of the most elite, important journalists in America. Just one registered Republican. 12 registered Democrats sit in that room. A ratio of 12 to 1. Democrat to Republican in that briefing room, including the reporter from the New York Times, including the reporter from the Los Angeles Times, including the reporter from Bloomberg, and of course, including both reporters from NPR. 12 to 1. Why isn't it 1 to 1? Why isn't the ratio of reporters who cover the most elite, important institution in the United States 1 to 1, Democrat to Republican? Or why isn't it 12 to 1, Republican to Democrat? It's because journalism has an original sin. Most of the people who go into the field of journalism are cut from a very similar cloth. They're cut from a generally left of center, liberal, overwhelmingly Democratic voting, college-educated group of voters. What's happened to journalism increasingly is it's become college-educated Democratic voters telling stories for fellow college-educated Democrat voters, just like Don Lemon. Stories that Democrats laugh at, enjoy, think is valid and true. But so much of what life is and what resonates for conservatives just doesn't make it into the mainstream media. It's one of the reasons Fox became so successful. They identified the gap, they identified the hole that mainstream media was no longer fulfilling for many of their customers. Pew. There was a Pew poll that I found and I put in my book. What percentage of adults say news organizations understand people like them, do not understand people like them? 58% of the American people say that the press does not understand people like them. What's happening now is journalism has reached a cultural crisis as well. It's not just about facts and it's about objectivity. People just say, reporters don't understand who I am. They don't get what I go through in life. Except, ladies and gentlemen, for one group. There is one group of Americans who say that the press understands people like them. College-educated Democrats. 71% of college-educated Democrats feel understood by the press. But if you're a Democrat with a high school diploma only, you say the press doesn't understand people like me. If you're an independent voter with both a college degree or a high school diploma, you say the press doesn't understand people like me. And certainly Republicans have felt this way for years, that the press doesn't understand people like us. It's a real crisis for journalism. But most journalist organizations know this. They see the polls. They know what these numbers show. But instead of saying, what's wrong with us? How come we're losing so many customers? What do we need to change about the way that we cover the news? They instead say, what's wrong with our customers? And this is why journalism in the modern era in America has driven itself into a narrow ideological cul-de-sac where they go round and round. Really, the only people who live on that cul-de-sac and increasingly subscribe to the news are college-educated Democrats. I want to show you a story. This is one of my favorite stories in the book about how stories make it on the air and are deceptive. Just flat out wrong from the day they appeared, from the moment they appeared. This was the Saturday after Election Day. Election Day, of course, was the Tuesday, November 2020. President Trump, Joe Biden. The election was so close in 4 states that it took to Saturday for the American people to be told who won the election. On that Saturday, the networks, Fox News, everybody broadcast that Joe Biden indeed had won the election. When that happened, church bells went off in Paris. Fireworks went off in London. It was covered by ABC News, CNN, and MSNBC. Let's watch.
Also celebrations abroad, places like Paris, where the actual church bells were ringing. Listen to that. That doesn't happen for every election. That was the reaction there to mark Trump losing, Joe Biden becoming our president-elect, or take London. Fireworks were set off, celebrating the historic win. Let's take this in. Millions of people in dozens and dozens of countries stopping to reflect on what we did, what you did here in America yesterday.
Fireworks went off to celebrate Joe Biden's win. Church bells. Does anybody know why the church bells rang in Paris that Saturday night? Because they always ring in Paris on Saturday nights. It's the call to Mass. Even though the French don't go to church anymore, they still ring church bells in France. Every Saturday night in Paris, having nothing to do with the American election. Do you know why the fireworks went off in London? Who said that? You must be British. Guy Fawkes Day, bonfire night. A 400-year-old British holiday to mark the failed assassination attempt against King James I in Parliament in 1605. Nothing to do with America's election. Zero. But if you're a reporter, if you're on the air and you are anti-Donald Trump, and all the reporters you know in your newsroom are anti-Donald Trump, and everybody thinks the same way you do, because journalism has that original sin of so many people going into it who are so like-minded. Was there no one at ABC, CNN, or MSNBC who could have said to them, hold on, wait a minute. Why are you assuming this has anything to do with America's election? Nobody caught it. It got on the air. Because if this is how you think that everybody I know is against President Trump, and everybody in your newsroom therefore thinks that way, you start to naturally reach the conclusion that it's only natural for people to celebrate Donald Trump's loss. It's only natural that church bells would ring and fireworks would go off. So when you hear they do, and if you have the power of being a reporter, you go on the air and you say what you think. You don't report. You say what you think. And what you say is tainted by the press's original sin of bias. And this is exactly how these stories got on the air. And once they did, and once it got brought to their attention as a result, frankly, of Twitter in England went crazy, both Labour and Conservative Party, the Tory party, started to tweet about this. Should we tell the Americans? Do the Americans realize what they're talking about? They started to become a laughingstock. Once they realized this, did they retract their stories? Did they apologize to their viewers? Did they say they got it wrong? They didn't. They just quietly moved on to the next story. Speaking of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, sitting Supreme Court Justice, passes away. Front page of the Washington Post. A pioneer devoted to equality. A fair headline. Antonin Scalia, sitting Supreme Court Justice, passes away. Front page of the Washington Post. Supreme Court conservative dismayed liberals. One Supreme Court justice receives a paean, a tribute in a headline. The other receives an attack obituary on the front page of the Washington Post. Now, why wasn't the headline for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court liberal dismayed conservatives? Or why wasn't the headline for the Washington Post, when Antonin Scalia died, a pioneer devoted to justice? My book is full of example after example after example of where the same event in the same context is covered by the same news outlet 180 degrees apart. It depends if the subject of the story is a Republican or a Democrat. And if it's a Democrat, they typically get very flowing, favorable coverage. If it's a Republican, the cynicism comes out immediately. New York Times. Elena Kagan, when she was nominated to the Supreme Court and goes before the Senate Judiciary Committee for her hearing, Kagan follows precedent by offering few opinions. Absolutely 100% accurate headline. For decades now, nominees go to the Supreme Court and they no longer answer any questions about cases that are pending before the court. This has become now decades the precedent, the accepted precedent of what justices nominees are supposed to do when they go before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Unless the nominee is Brett Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh ducks questions on presidential powers and subpoenas, the New York Times tells its readers. Same thing. He followed the exact same precedent, did the exact same thing that Elena Kagan did in the exact same newspaper. But for Elena Kagan, she followed precedent. Kavanaugh ducked questions. This is the double standard that I see time and time again. I lived it as a press secretary on Capitol Hill. I lived it as a press secretary at the White House. I live it now when I watch the news. But the media still won't come to terms with it. They still say it's one isolated incident, or two isolated incidents, or three isolated incidents, or several isolated incidents. But we criticize Democrats, so therefore we're fair. No. The occasional criticism of Democrats doesn't make up for the overwhelmingly lopsided and imbalanced way the news is brought to you by too many in the mainstream media. Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi goes to the White House for a meeting with President Trump, which means it wasn't going to be a good meeting. Nothing was going to get done. And at one point, in a meeting with congressional leaders and President Trump, she gets up, points her finger at President Trump, and delivers a lecture. And the press loves it. The New York Times, viral photo captures power dynamic between Trump and Pelosi. The picture went viral. Iconic image, the New York Times calls it. Morning Joe, iconic photo, says Mika Brzezinski. CNN, one woman standing up and, giving it to the president. Of course she's going to own that, says CNN. Point your finger at the president. Deliver your point as a powerful woman. The press will praise you for it. Or will they? This is Arizona Governor Jan Brewer. Arizona Governor Jan Brewer met with then-sitting President Barack Obama when he flew into Arizona. She met him on the tarmac, and she, with her finger, did unto President Obama as Nancy Pelosi, with her finger, did unto President Trump. Based on what you saw with Nancy Pelosi and President Trump, you would think the New York Times would praise her for it. Iconic photo, correct? You'd think all the media would praise Jan Brewer for it. No. NBC News, who have you ever seen talking to the president like this? CNN, the same outlet that praised Pelosi. Perhaps you should have shown him a bit more respect. Time and time again, ladies and gentlemen, if a Republican does it, there's something wrong with it. If a Democrat does it, they deserve praise. This is too often what we don't read and see, because who does these comparisons? When you read the paper, you look at the headline and you kind of accept it. But these comparisons keep happening. This is the most recent one. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when she won her election, she defeated a Democratic longtime congressman in a New York primary in June of 2018, and New York Times headlined her story, "Emerges as a Political Star." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Well, just a couple months ago, in Texas, another female defeated an incumbent congressman. This was in a special election. Along the border with Mexico, she became the first Mexican-American elected to the Congress of the United States. She won as a Republican, a district that for more than 100 years was in Democratic hands. How did the New York Times, same paper, cover the rise of this Hispanic, Maya Flores, just elected Congresswoman? The rise of the far-right Latina. One of 3 Republican Latinos vying to transform South Texas politics by shunning moderates and embracing the extreme. Maya Flores ran on a platform of love of God, love of faith, love of country, love of family. And the New York Times says that's extreme. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in my home state of New York, is registered as a socialist in the Democrat Socialist of America Party. To the New York Times, the one who loves their country, loves God, loves family is extreme. The socialist is a rising political star. Example after example, it doesn't stop. Same paper, same type of event, same context, totally different standard of journalism. Now, it's not only what you see in the paper, it's often what you don't see. President Biden, when he was elected, gave a speech to the Congress in 2017, his first speech to a joint session of the Congress. As always, the opposition party gets to pick somebody to give the rebuttal to the president's speech. The Republicans in 2017 picked Senator Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina, African-American Republican senator. He gave his speech. It was a wonderful rebuttal, especially if you're a conservative. Powerful message from Senator Tim Scott. A Democratic county chairman in the state of Texas didn't think it was so wonderful. He called Tim Scott an Oreo. It got some coverage. Fox News covered it. The New York Times didn't cover it. The Washington Post didn't cover it. CBS, ABC, MSNBC, NBC didn't cover it. Now, in the research for my book, I found 2 instances of obscure Republican legislators, one in Ohio, one in Florida, who said racially tinged things that never should have been said by anybody. The New York Times found these 2 obscure legislators and hammered them for it, deservedly so. Anybody who said what those 2 Republican state legislators said deserves to have their marks elevated and the light shown on them to send a signal that nobody in this modern era should talk the way they talked. So why then? Why would they elevate 2 obscure Republican state legislators? Do they not elevate a Democrat county chairman who called Senator Tim Scott an Oreo? Because it's not just the news that you see as bias, it's what you're not told that shows the bias of the media as well. I want you to meet Madeline Leader. Madeline Leader worked at the Democratic National Committee in 2017. She was in charge of their data services department, and they had a job opening. They needed to interview somebody for a position at the DNC. And she sent an email to her list of people, and she said, I prefer you not to forward this to cisgender, straight, white males. In other words, we have a job at the Democratic National Committee as long as you're not straight, you're not white, and you're not male. Job's for you, unless you're one of those three things. Now, could you imagine if today, this morning, the Republican National Committee had a job opening, and somebody at the RNC sent out a notice to their friends, sent it an email, and the email said, don't forward this to gay, black, females. We have a job, but you can't get it if you're gay, black, or female. Ladies and gentlemen, I guarantee you, the mainstream media would have instantly risen up in full feeding frenzy mode against the RNC and demanded not only that the staffer who sent that email get fired, but the chairwoman of the RNC get fired for allowing this type of insensitivity and hate to create underneath her. Did Madeline Leader's statement get any coverage? Not in the New York Times, not on CBS, ABC, or NBC. Once again, Democrats can get away with things that Republicans can't. It wasn't news that she did it. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through that, and I want to close with also part of the double standard. President Biden won the election that Saturday in November. People immediately poured out in the streets of the White House, outside the White House, to celebrate. Aaron Rupert, a reporter with Vox News, 700,000 followers on Twitter. It's party time outside the White House, tweeted Aaron Rupert. Some 11 hours later, there's a football game in South Bend, Indiana. Notre Dame against Clemson. And in a huge upset, Notre Dame beat Clemson. College football fans pour out onto the field. Aaron Rupert, the same reporter who earlier was tweeting about party time, now turns into a COVID scold. Not ideal during a worsening pandemic. You see, Aaron Rupert knew that COVID knows the cause. And if the cause is good, it will pass over these people. But because these people might include some people that are Republicans. Now, all of a sudden, it's no longer party time in South Bend. It's something you shouldn't engage in during a pandemic. He wasn't alone. Axios, allegedly an objective down-the-middle internet publication. Joe Biden's victory, America erupts. 11 hours later, Notre Dame sacks Clemson. Party amid pandemic. Right back to that same double standard. The Democrats could celebrate Joe Biden's victory, having nothing to do with COVID. But you couldn't do that for something that's just been done forever, college football game. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why I wrote the book. I'm a big believer in the press. I subscribe to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. As I said, I watch CNN, I watch Fox. I want the press to be fair. I want the press to be neutral. I don't want to work hard. I want to be able to pick up one source of information and say to myself, I can go with it. That source is right. That source is objective. They're giving me the facts. And as a citizen, I will tell the government what I think of those facts. I will tell the government what to do about those facts. And so will my neighbor, and so will everybody else, because we're all equal citizens. But what's happened now is the press is not only telling us certain facts, leaving out other facts, but they're trying to tell us what to do with those facts. The amount of opinion that has seeped into so-called objective journalism has reached all-time alarming levels. And I call on the press to do better. They would help themselves so much if they would only allow different crops of people to become journalists, to welcome conservatives into newsrooms, to welcome diversity of thought, the most powerful diversity, diversity of ideas into newsrooms. I wish conservatives would be more willing to enter into the field of journalism. But I'm afraid journalism has also become a place that's inhospitable, where they know they're not welcome. So many newsrooms now have a problem, particularly with younger journalists, creating an inhospitable environment for anybody who dares to think differently from the current thought. We need a strong media in America. We need an independent, free media in America. But the media needs to do better. We all count on them. We need them. Our country can do better. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. It's been my honor. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Take this side.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or if you prefer this side.
Don't matter me.
You're the guest. Good job.
Now I get grilled.
No. Just a friendly conversation. So, Ari, I want to start. Well, first, let me say, I'm sure that Ari's presentation has provoked some questions, inspired some questions. Staff members of the library have cards. If you have a question now, if one comes up during our conversation, raise your hand, you'll get a card, write out your question, and we'll try to get to it in about 15 minutes, something like that. Ari, so much of what you had to say there resonates very powerfully with me. The situation that you described has gotten worse in certainly the 40 years of my career. Young people particularly are being taught in journalism schools that there's no such thing as objectivity, that it's a ruse, it's a lie, that they ought to be activists in politics. And a lot of us old fogies strongly disagree and think that we're headed in the wrong direction. And when people ask me what can the media do to improve its image or to fight against the label of fake news, my answer is always, we could do a better job. Let's start there. Now, having said that, you touched on your decision largely to leave Fox News out of this conversation. I submit, doesn't that make it potentially the wrong kind of conversation? Because what you don't have here, you do get to the cultural aspect, the educational aspect, where most journalists will get to what is the mainstream, but in these organizations that you highlighted, we do tend to come from the same places and do tend to think in the same ways. The biggest change I've seen, though, in the past, say, 25 years that we've known each other, is how media gets paid for. And that you don't talk about. You've probably noticed that CNN has quite deliberately, in the past 3 weeks, taken large steps to fix the problem that you highlighted at the beginning of your reel. Don Lemon's not a primetime anchor anymore at CNN. Jim Acosta, John Harwood, Brian Stelter, they're all gone from the network. Do you think that CNN's attempt to reposition themselves more like they were before is going to pay financial dividends to the shareholders of that company?
Okay. You make a very good White House reporter. I counted 3 questions in that one question. First, about Fox. You know, I just have to point out, David, that when the authors that I have in mind who wrote their books about Fox, including Brian Stelter at CNN, when they went on the air and talked to fellow journalists about it, not a single journalist said, "Why didn't you write about CNN?" So this is my point about the double standard.
I didn't interview Brian Stelter.
No, you didn't, but Brian Stelter could write a book
I can only
Fox.
do what I can do.
And in my case, for Fox, no, I wrote a book about the mainstream media. Now, I do believe that what's happening with conservative media...
Pardon me for cutting you off, but how can the number one, by far, okay, top 8 shows on cable news in Q2 this year, and 9 of the top 10, as you know, are Fox News. How can that not be the mainstream media?
It's conservative media. That's why. It's separated from the mainstream.
Well, why
media,
don't you
and
call
only-
it the liberal
and the
media
only-
then, rather than the mainstream?
Oh, I
mean,
do that too.
Okay.
In my book, I call it the liberal media. I never call it fake news, because I think that's a lazy trope. And if I'm going to call it fake, I'm going to show the example that makes it fake. But the point I make here, Fox never would have existed if the networks didn't lose viewers. They lost viewers in part because of technology, but mostly because of ideology. The networks had everybody before cable existed. And then when cable came out, the reason Fox was able to be so successful was just like any monopoly that loses its customers, they stopped serving the needs of their customers. And so conservatives broke away, being so unsatisfied with that which they were being served. If the networks had done a fair and neutral job of telling the news, they could have smothered Fox in the cradle. But they weren't neutral, they were liberal. And that gave birth to Fox. You asked about the economics, and I do address that in here. One of the most important reasons this polarization in the media has happened is because advertisers stopped advertising, particularly in print publications. And so newspapers particularly became dependent on subscribers. And when you become dependent on subscribers, it's very different. Advertisers want to have a broad appeal and don't offend anybody, be a mass newspaper, and stories reflected that. Editorial judgment reflected that. When the internet came up and everybody lost their classified ads and so many of the rest of their ads, the only way to have reporters on payroll and keep bureaus open was to have subscribers. And so one of the things I cite in my book is the top editor at the New York Times who said, every time Donald Trump calls us fake news, I hear the ka-ching of the cash register as new subscribers join the New York Times, counting on us to resist President Trump. So the subscriber base of journalism has pushed people into polarization. So I addressed that. As for CNN, I think it's a fascinating experiment, and I really want to watch what happens there. It's one of the reasons I watch CNN. The new leadership has clearly read my book. They've watched the Don Lemon clip. I'm not sure shuffling Don Lemon from nighttime to morning time solves anything. If I were CNN, I would rip the Band-Aid off all in one swoop and not have these one individual, let this reporter go here, let another reporter go there. They're feeling their way forward. I think they just need to announce the new CNN, the return to old-fashioned objective news. And they're not doing that. They're dealing with it piecemeal. So I hope ultimately they'll be successful, and then I'll be fascinated to see economically if there's really a market for neutral journalism in America, or if we are now so content going to our camps that nobody wants to watch objective news anymore.
It's interesting that, not to harp on your relationship, but your employer can go where the money is, but CNN, you believe, has a duty to go where currently nobody believes there's any money.
No, CNN bills itself as facts first, objective.
It bills itself that way.
Yeah, so CNN says they're objective. Fox says it's conservative. It says it's right of center. And its nighttime shows are clearly labeled as opinion shows.
But that's not your only complaint with CNN, is that they don't label themselves as liberal.
If they labeled themselves as liberal, I think they would be honest. But they won't. They want to consider themselves neutral reporters. And especially like John Harwood. My book is full of examples. John Harwood's the former CNN White House correspondent, his stories were indistinguishable from the statements that would have been given by the Democratic National Committee spokesperson. He regularly opinionized and gave opinions. And with the blessing of CNN's former leadership, it's the only reason you could do that on the air. And he's been let go now by the new leadership at CNN, which makes me more fascinated to see, will CNN actually become objective?
I anticipate that CNN is not going to have a business success because clearly what we've seen since viewers and readers had choice created for them by the internet, people want more of what they already think. They don't want to be told things that are new and fresh. Yeah. Some people do. You do. I believe that. I hope you believe that I do. I have a broad media diet, but to subscribe, mostly people want more of what they want. And for a lot of people, that's not news at all.
I think it's
they want more crossword puzzles, or they want more about knitting, or they'd like more about cooking. they can subscribe to all of that and tailor their diet.
The question I get more than any other question is, where can I go to get objective news? Now, maybe it's just an intellectual question and people don't mean it when they get back to their couches. But I think, like everything in America, there's a pendulum, and the pendulum, thankfully, in this country doesn't swing too wide, but it always swings back toward a reasonable center.
That's my
And
hope,
I think that we're going through a split era of media taste, but after we've had enough of it, people are going to say, can't I just go one place and get told the truth? And that creates a business opportunity, somebody down the middle. Maybe not in 2023, but maybe in 2025 or 2026.
I like places that tell me the truth as well. I don't think you've told the truth about the Trump-Russia story in your book. You refer to that frequently as discredited, that there was no there there. The Senate Republican-led Intelligence Committee, after 3 years of investigation in a 1,000-page long report, found, and I'll just hit some bullet points, that the Russian government intentionally manipulated U.S. social media and other channels to promote Trump as a candidate.
True.
That the Russian government viewed many members of the Trump campaign as manipulable targets. That members of the campaign, including the campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, eagerly cooperated with known Russian intelligence agents. True, I mean, he accepted a pardon after he was convicted of that, so that, as you know, accepting a pardon is an admission of guilt. On June 3rd, 2016, an email was received by Donald Trump Jr. offering material that would, quote, incriminate Hillary, continuing to quote, this is obviously very high level and sensitive information, but is part of Russia and its government's support of Mr. Trump. Responded Donald J. Trump Jr., pretty high in the campaign. If it's what you say, I love it. So there may not have been collusion, I guess you could define it that way, but there was certainly an eager intent to collude.
I'm not Donald Trump's spokesman, and I won't be Donald Trump's spokesman. I wrote a book about the mainstream media. Now, to your fair question, the issue right away is what took place in 2020 that led to everybody saying something was wrong, that Russia was interfering. It was the hacking of the Democrat National Committee's email and Hillary Clinton's email. This is what was alleged that Donald Trump colluded in. There has never been anything indicating that they had anything to do with the hack of the DNC or of Hillary Clinton. Zero. The Steele dossier, which became the biggest focus issue.
Absolute scandal the way it was covered.
Thank you. And that's my
totally
point.
agree with you.
So, yes, I wrote what I wrote.
That there was nothing there. That there was nothing there.
My point in writing was how many false stories aired, especially on CNN, with information about Donald Trump colluding with Russia that was flat out false, that had to be retracted by CNN.
An earlier example of frequent, largely, massively reported false information was experienced in 2003 when members of the Bush White House, I think maybe including you at the podium, assured us that the United States knew that Saddam Hussein was in possession of weapons of mass destruction.
Correct.
I'm not holding you accountable for that error, but isn't it possible to make an error, even a big one, without just not caring? I think you probably did care. You made a mistake.
Yeah, and that's exactly why the Bush administration announced a bipartisan commission to investigate how we got that wrong, because we did care. What mainstream media kept doing was making the same mistakes over and over and over and over again. Because once they got it wrong once, they were determined, well, we'll get it right the next time. And it didn't matter if that one was wrong or if the next one was wrong, a la election night with the church bells.
Yeah.
They just kept getting things wrong.
Yeah.
And there's no question about we were wrong about WMD. And President Bush acknowledged it, I acknowledged it. The one thing, not to get off track here, no one ever lied about it. I faithfully reported to the American people that which I was told was the conclusion of the CIA. So when people say Bush lied, people died, it's as wrong can be. We, though, were factually wrong about Saddam having WMD, and we've acknowledged it.
Good. Let's go to question.
All right, thank you both. Okay, we have a number of questions here. My apologies. Okay, do you think the leaking of the Supreme Court decision was a calculated plan to make abortion a campaign topic?
The question was...
I'm sorry, I got my mic on now. Let me repeat that. I apologize. First question. Do you think the leaking of the Roe ruling was a calculated decision to influence the election?
No. I think the leaking of the ruling was an attempt to reverse the ruling itself. I think it was an attempt to put pressure on the justices so they wouldn't ultimately rule that way. And the political consequences of, I think, were secondary at that time. I think it was much more aimed at switching it.
All right, next question. We have somebody who wants to know, what was the coolest thing about flying on Air Force One?
The coolest thing about flying on Air Force One was never, even on a rainy day at LaGuardia, did I ever hear the words, "We're number 17 for takeoff."
Is there a litmus test, so to speak, for accepting any variety of news feed as authentic or fact-based?
A litmus test for accepting what?
Any variety of news feed as authentic or fact-based.
Oh, absolutely. It's called common sense. And it's really what you have to possess. I mean, one of the conclusions I've reached way before my book, and this is the greatest thing about our American democracy, it's up to each of us. Mm-hmm. We have to read. We have to be informed citizens. And look, I was raised by liberal Democratic parents. I was raised as a Democrat. I entered college a liberal Democrat. Because of Jimmy Carter, I graduated a conservative Democrat. And then I changed parties right after college because of Ronald Reagan. But my point is, it's up to us to think. And when you see something in the news, you're the only ones who have to have the ability to sniff it out and say that just doesn't sound right. And one of my best clues for you is anytime you read a story that has nothing but anonymous sources, just file it in halfway in the back of your mind. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but until you see enough evidence of somebody on the record, don't think it's right. I've learned a long time ago that a lot of Washington reporters have a lot of good sources. So if they have an anonymous source, I don't rule it out. But I will let it take time to develop before I leap to conclusions or figure out if it's true or not. And I'll also tell you that one of the greatest sins of journalism, and I have this in my book too, is reporters just give away anonymity. I can't tell you how many times I get calls now where the first thing a young reporter says to me is, "We can do this on background if you like." I mean, I haven't even tried to duck and dodge yet, and they're offering me that escape hatch. I don't know where journalism went astray like that as opposed to the old days. Ron Fournier never would have let anybody, the White House chief correspondent for AP, never would have let anybody be on background give an anonymous quote unless it was a matter of national security. But now you just say something nasty about somebody and you get an anonymous quote. Nobody should ever be allowed to say anything nasty about anybody without putting their name on it. And if reporters made people put their names on it, you see so much less nastiness in politics. Because now people know it's not like the internet. You can't just anonymously let things rip and be mean. You actually have to have responsibility. So anonymity is one of your other clues about whether or not news is something you can take home with you.
Yeah, I'd like to underline, it is up to the consumers of news. First and foremost, this marketplace that Ari and I both hope exists for quality, fair journalism, that's got to be created by readers. And so if you say that it matters to you, then you need to vote with your eyeballs and potentially with your subscriptions. Because right now the incentives are all in the other direction. I'd also add slow down. I think this is implicit in what you said. Get off Twitter. The chance that you're going to get the right true story in the first 30 minutes, let alone 30 seconds, is almost zero. I remember as a young reporter when there was an earthquake in the Bay Area that collapsed a bridge and interrupted the World Series. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. You know, I killed 235 people in the first edition of the Miami Herald and had to somehow bring them all back to life by the final. You know, the first cut is rarely complete and accurate. So you've got time. Your world's not going to end if you wait 30 minutes to angrily, or a day or 2 days, to angrily spread a story to your friends on Facebook or through your Twitter feed. If it's true, it'll still be news 2 days from now. If it's true and important.
But I would still encourage you to be on my Twitter.
I don't have one, so I practice what I preach. It's the worst thing that ever happened to journalism.
We have a question actually for two questions for both of you along the same lines. They would like to know your thoughts on the difference between a news anchor and a commentator, and is there a place for both in the media?
At CNN, under their former president, there was almost no distinction between a news anchor and a commentator. He encouraged, Jeff Zucker, the former president, encouraged his anchors to let their opinions out. And their opinions were always anti-Trump, anti-Republican. It was part of their marketing. I'm old school, and I believe an anchor should simply report the news. If I were an anchor, I would want to be boring. I would want to be the kind of person who said, when I heard it from that anchor, I just accepted it. Commentators have a very different position. It's kind of like what an opinion page of a newspaper is. It should be interesting, thought-provocative opinion pieces. That's what I hope I do on Fox News, by giving my opinion. Interestingly, on Fox, I'm one of the people who kind of pushes back on a lot of things, just to try to put what I hope is just more grounding into some of the things that are reported. But that's the difference. One is opinion by design, and the other should be objective.
Yeah, and consuming news on the internet, we have not, nobody, this is not liberal, conservative, no one has figured out how to very effectively label and differentiate opinion from reported news. It's a huge problem at the Post, where institutionally, you may not believe this, but we have some very strong lines between those of us like me who are paid for our opinions. And, you know, there's a saying in the old newspaper business, and I'll clean this up for a library audience, that, you know, opinions are like belly buttons. Everybody's got one. There's a strong line between that and the newsroom, because we do see these as two different functions. Making that clear on the internet as our material gets glimpsed on phones or passed around through tweets or retweet is very difficult. And so I would urge everybody to put a little extra time. Is there that little, you know, word under the byline that says opinion, this sort of thing? Look for clues, if you can find them, as to whether this is even intended to be straight news.
All right, Ari, you said before we started that you didn't want me to pull any punches, so I'm going to put that to the test here. A question online. That distinction between we lied and we were misinformed, how much do you suppose it matters to a generation of Iraqis now in their 20s and 30s, having only ever known a life of war and chaos?
Well, actually, I think if you ask the Iraqis today, they would tell you they like their lives a whole lot better now than they did under Saddam Hussein. So I think that's the simple answer to that. But I think it's pretty clear what the difference is between being given information that is wrong, that you faithfully report, and it turns out to be wrong, and lying.
Next question. Somebody wants to know, do you know what the Fox News headline was when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died?
I do not.
I looked it up. Would you like to know?
Sure.
Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dead at 87. Subhead, our nation has lost a jurist of historic stature. Chief Justice John G. Roberts.
Good for them.
Next question. Why is it so difficult to tell the truth and be objective, giving the true answer instead of speaking around it and giving parallels to show objectivity?
I think it's because of the changing technology. Our technology has now allowed us to consume the news we want to consume. And it's married to journalists who overwhelmingly are cut from that same cloth. And that's the problem. If the White House ratio was 1-to-1, news would be different. The questions that get asked to the press secretary would be different. The tenor of the briefing room would be very different. I've twice gone to Columbia Journalism School now and given speeches or done events for classes there. And both times, once was in 1998, and at the end of my session with these 12 future journalists, I said, just out of curiosity, in the 1996 election, how many of you voted for Bob Dole, and how many of you voted for Bill Clinton? I said, Clinton first. 11 hands went up. And I said, so only one of you voted for Dole? And the 12th guy in the room went, no, I voted for Ralph Nader. 22 years later, I'm invited back to Columbia Journalism School, and I asked the same question. This was in 2020, and I said, in the 2016 election, how many of you voted for Hillary Clinton, and how many for Donald Trump? Every single hand in the room went up for Hillary Clinton. And this is the problem. Technology allows us to pick and choose our news, but for the mainstream media, and what in essence is the thinking of most mainstream journalists, they're cut from that cloth. Now, there are different journalism schools. If you go to University of Alabama, if you go to some of other places, you are going to find a little more 50-50-ish in the J schools. But for most of America, it's like Columbia Journalism School, which means for most newsrooms, it's like Columbia Journalism School.
Would you consider anybody who identifies as a democratic socialist to be an extremist?
Yes. Yes, I view socialism as an extreme philosophy in the United States of America. It's one of the reasons there have been historically so few socialists, because our pendulum swings very much toward that center right, center left. And it's fascinating because in the early 1900s, at a time when socialism was really, in the late 1800s as well, when socialism was on the rise in Europe, and particularly in England, it was not on the rise here. We've always been cut from a different cloth. The socialist movement really never got off the ground in the United States. It is a teeny tiny fraction, and its ideas are anathema to so much of what's made America successful. So yes, socialism to me is absolutely an American extremist idea.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Let me pick out a good one then here, and while I do that, I will remind everybody that the book is available for sale up here in the corner, and Ari will be signing copies following the event. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to make it from my mother. I'm going to make it a friendly just question. So I can ask a filler, and then I can look for a good one to end on. How's that?
I'll fill in, and while you find a good one. I like your suggestion, and I hope that people who have some influence over hiring will include conservative reporters in our DEI missions. And I plead with you to try to get some conservatives into the Republican Party.
Oh, just wait till 6 weeks from now. You'll see a lot more conservatives in the Republican Party.
No, you would agree, I'm sure, given your political history, that the Republican Party has been taken over by radicals.
I think there's a huge difference here. No. The Republican Party remains a conservative party.
Can you list
Donald
any
Trump was not a
position?
conservative.
Donald
Trump
Trump's
was a
not
populist.
conservative.
Donald Trump was not ideological conservative. I don't think he really was ideological. He was much more transactional. But the Republican Party is still a conservative party. The question is, there's a fight in the Republican Party between the establishment and the outsiders. This is the struggle Republicans have. It's our split. The Democrat split is much more between the progressives and the liberals with only one moderate, maybe two left, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema.
Okay, we'll agree to disagree.
And I've got
he'd
nothing
say
that's
that.
going to lead to a better exchange than that. So David, Ari, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, ladies and
Thank
gentlemen.
you, Eric.